Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to take an interesting journey for those people out there who have always had the question, if you were an adoptee, how would you go about finding your parents? Especially in a world that seems complicated, but narrowing down through things such as DNA testing and genetic engineering. One man took his journey in the beginning years, we're talking back in the 1980s, where you could find yourself having to dig through piles of newspapers, library searches, as well as legal records such as birth certificates. But sometimes through a story like this, you might find that some people aren't really telling you the truth, and it's kind of hard to know what direction to go. On the program today, we're joined with author of the book, Finding Family, My Search for Roots and the Secrets in My DNA. Our guest joining us to share this story today is Mr. Richard Hill. Richard, thank you for being on the program today.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for having me on.
You know, I remember years ago when I thought I would start a genealogy search just to discover my family tree, just how exhaustive that is. I couldn't imagine being someone in your position trying to discover who your birth parents are. Let's talk about how all this started for you and what you encountered.
Well, I grew up actually not knowing that I was adopted. And what happened was I was 18 years old, just a couple weeks before going off to college, and I was experiencing some chest pain at night when I would lie down. So I made an appointment with the doctor, and this was not my original family doctor I'd had all my life. He had retired, and there was a new guy that had my records. And so he quickly diagnosed my problem as acid reflux, and he was thinking that stress might be the cause, so he started asking me questions. He asked if I was feeling pressure to do well in school, or if I was, anxious about going away to college, and my truthful answer to those questions was no. So he's looking through my medical file, and he comes up with one more question. How do you feel about being adopted? Well, until that moment, I didn't know I was adopted, so it was quite a revelation.
You know, I can imagine how you must have felt. Myself, I never knew my birth father, and as I was growing up, my mom had told me that he had died, and so there it is, straightforward. But then some years later, as I was going into, I think, my high school years, we were talking one time, and she kind of goofed and slipped and said that he was still alive, and I got confused by that. Wait a minute, you were telling me this, now what's going on? So she sets me down one day, and she says, well, the man in your birth certificate is actually someone who decided to step into the role when you were being born, but the true biological father is the one who's, had died. And, and I said, so it leaves you in a situation with questions. Until that point, I really didn't, it was sort of there it was, and I didn't care to pursue it. But it's that moment that you decide to pursue it, like, for instance, to really find out who you are. Is that something that you became very curious about?
Well, yes, I did, although in my case it was delayed a long time because, as I said, I was really within 2 weeks of going away to college. And I was so focused on my future that the distant past didn't seem to make that much difference. And again, I loved my parents. They loved me. I figured they had their reasons for keeping it from me. So I chose not to make an issue of it. And I just kind of went about my life and went to college for 4 years, got married, started having children. And it was 14 years later that this kind of raised its head again. And that was because my adoptive father had a stroke. And he spent the last year of his life in a hospital bed where he was mostly paralyzed. And I was up there visiting him several times a week during my lunch hour. And one day, just completely out of the blue, he starts talking about my adoption. And I had always assumed that it was an anonymous thing, that it was a completely closed adoption where they probably got me from some agency or something. And no, that wasn't the case at all. It was a friend of a friend type of situation, and my birth mother had come to live with them for the last 5 months of her pregnancy. And I was born, and my parents took me home from the hospital, and she went back to the city where she was from, and that was it. And my father, of course, that surprised me quite a bit. But then he had another piece of information, and it seems that another one of my assumptions was wrong. I assumed that most unwed mothers were very young girls and that they might go on and marry later and have other children. Well, my birth mother managed to do this backwards. She had actually been married at a very young age, had a son, got divorced, and then during the divorce time, she got pregnant again for me by another man. And so I had a brother who was actually older than me. And when my dad told me that I had a brother, he also said, I think you should find your brother. And that was the thing that really triggered the search and really got me going.
You know, that's where your story and my story uniquely are the same. Okay, I wasn't adopted. I was with my biological mother, but here's the thing, is I decided to go in pursuit as I was in my adult years. I think I was around 31. And first of all, find out, who's my biological father, his best friend, see how I can connect with him, that sort of thing. But then he also had 3 more sons after me, okay? Was with a woman, so I actually contacted that gentleman. Of course, he said, well, I had no idea you even existed. Okay, well, sorry about that, not trying to blow anybody out of the water. And, so, like, pursuits like this, you sort of have to be careful, because of how it can change, I guess, the perception of people whose lives that you come into, from my experience anyway. So he says, well, do you mind if I take a little bit? I said, look, I've been out here 30-plus years. I don't know, another couple of years isn't going to bother me at all. I'm just trying to reach out to let somebody know that I'm out there. And so, uniquely enough, the youngest of the half-brothers actually has my same name, strangely enough, which is Daniel. Now,
Okay.
so he finally calls a couple of months later, and we're talking, and so that's that. And so, okay, well, I just want to let you know that I was out here. How you want to pursue this is up to you, but that's about it. So a good 13-plus years passes by, and all of a sudden I get a call from him, sort of out of the blue, and I'm like, well, I wonder what he's calling for. And sure enough, what he tells me is he says, we have a sister out there, and it turns out I have a sister out there who was older than me.
Oh.
So that's where our story sort of is similar in a way. But it's pretty crazy what begins to happen out there, I think, when you begin to pursue something like this, such as you have, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And I think it goes to show you how much people were ashamed about anything back then. That anything that was not a perfect family was somehow something you had to hide. People, didn't have out-of-wedlock children. They certainly wouldn't admit to it. Wouldn't admit to, giving up a child for adoption. A lot of people hid divorces. They didn't even tell their kids they'd been divorced before. It was kind of an era of, like I said, it's almost like everything was shameful that wasn't perfect. And I think today's society is a lot more open. Most adoptions are open. I did read a statistic recently that said 40% of the babies born in the U.S. now are born to unwed mothers. That's kind of a shocking statistic, but yet, no one really bats an eye. I mean, pretty much everybody knows unwed mothers with children, and it's not really a surprise anymore.
I know. That's where I was really intrigued with the story that you share here, is thinking about the time, where a lot of that was kind of put away, put aside, and so forth. So because of that, whereas this day and age, it's a lot more open, and so it seems easier, so to speak. But that was where I found it kind of intriguing when you were looking for birth certificates, that the particular state that you were trying to get one from actually sent you lied to directly. What was going on there?
Well, one of the first steps I took was to apply for my birth certificate. I'd never actually seen my birth certificate, so I went ahead, again, I was in my 30s by then, and I went ahead and applied for it and wondered what they would send me. I didn't think they would send me the original one because I'm in Michigan and adoption records are sealed in Michigan. But I was curious what they would send. Would they send me an adoption certificate or what? And, well, they actually send me, and this happens all the time, they send out which basically is a fake birth certificate. It lists you and your birth date, and it lists your adoptive parents as if they were your biological parents. And they certify it as being a copy of a true and complete record. And that just kind of blew me away because, I thought, well, it's keeping the record secret. I suppose they had their reasons for doing that, and I kind of understood in some ways. But to actually forge documents that were untrue, that seemed to me to be kind of crossing a line, but it's done all the time.
Wow, that's pretty amazing to find out. Now, how did you know that it was that?
Well, because I knew I was adopted. I'd had this conversation. Well, I had found out from the doctor, and then years later, my dad told me about it and everything. So, I knew I was adopted. I knew they were not my biological parents. So I was very shocked to get a birth certificate that showed them as my biological parents.
Now, as you began to, you met your brother, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, so what was that experience like for you as you were beginning to, meet and talk to people, really follow the trail, the paper trail as you were describing, to come and encounter these people? Because I remember as I was reading that, you look at movies today, for instance, and you see stories like this, and there's this big happy reunion. But I know in my case, I don't know that that's really totally the case. To me, there was a sense of shock. Like, then what do you do next, or what do you say? That sort of a thing.
Yeah, and I think that was true in my case too, because when I contacted my brother. Actually, I contacted him through his aunt. His aunt had been my birth mother's best friend and who knew about me and had always wondered whatever happened to me. And after speaking with her, she went and talked to my brother and told him about this. And he was, of course, blown away because, he didn't know anything about me. And by that time, I had been, I knew I'd had a brother for many months, I think, since my father told me, and I, in fact, started searching. But he just found out about it then. So when we had our first conversation over the phone, you could tell he was still kind of shell-shocked. And then when we met, it was a good meeting. It was a cordial meeting, but I think he was a bit reserved yet at the time. And I only think it took time as we would meet periodically with my wife and his girlfriend, and we go out and meet for dinner, and then I started, he loved to play golf, so I started picking up golf again, and I went on some golfing excursions with him, and we got to know each other better, and it was just a gradual warming and getting close, and now I've known him for more than 30 years, and we are quite close now. Not geographically because he lives in another state, but we talk on the phone regularly and see each other, once a year or so. So it's been a good ongoing relationship.
Now, what has been the reaction from people who have read your book?
Well, people seem to love the book. I've got over 400 reviews on Amazon, and it's averaging almost 5 stars. I think the most common comment I get is that I couldn't put it down. I think the story, the way I wrote it, reads quickly, and once you get to the end of one chapter, you kind of want to keep going to the next. So I hear that a lot, that people get into it and just can't keep themselves from reading. In fact, one of the funniest comments I got on one of the Amazon reviews was a review titled "No dishes got washed here today."
Mm-hmm.
And it was by a woman who just sat down, started to read the book, and didn't do anything else the rest of the day.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'll tell you from my experiences, I picked it up last night and began to read, and I got more than halfway through it. Like, wow, this is quite a story here, especially as you begin to discover, for instance, who your mom and your father were.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go ahead and talk about them a little bit.
Okay. Well, it turns out my birth mother had a rather brief and challenging life. When she was, I'd say maybe 13, 14 years old, her father left the family, abandoned his family, and just took off. And her mother had to go back to work to support the family. And she had one older sister and one younger sister. And she and the younger sister were put into a Salvation Army home because there was nobody around to take care of them. And they lived in that home for like 2 years. And then her mother remarried, took the girls back. And what I understand is my birth mother hated her stepfather. And that's one of the reasons that she then, at like age 17, took off and married a guy from her high school. And then at 18, she gets pregnant, has a son, and then they get divorced. And then I think like age 20, she gets pregnant again for me. And then at age 21, she and her younger sister are killed in a Jeep accident. So she had a very eventful and short life.
And how about your father?
Well, my father, it turns out, he had been one of like 8 kids born on a ranch in Texas. And during the 1940s, he had happened to work his way up into Michigan and discovered that the auto plants and everything were really booming, and there were a lot of jobs available at the auto companies. And he ended up getting a job at the Henry Ford Technical Institute, and he was an instructor there, and he was like a basketball coach and things like that. And then he got into the bar business. He owned a bar and managed that for quite a while, and he also got into horses. He was involved in raising and racing trotter horses, the sulkies that jockeys ride on the little carts behind the horse. And he was big into that for his life. So he was a pretty active man into a lot of things. He was very involved in civic activities. He was like the president of his Rotary Club in his area. So he was pretty well liked, pretty popular, and turns out, pretty active.
And how, when you were beginning to discover these things about your birth parents as well as your siblings, did you see similarities in your character, whether they be physical or, whatever it may be?
Well, when the first relative I found, of course, was my brother on my mother's side. I found him, say, over 30 years ago. And we were both tall, slender. I wouldn't say we looked alike, certainly not as adults, but if you look at some of our childhood photos, I think you see more of a physical resemblance. He inherited my mother's blue eyes, and I did not. But other than that, I think you can see some resemblance in our early childhood photos. We compared health things, because one of the things I was interested in was what health issues might I have inherited. And of course, we were still, in our 30s then when we met, so we were pretty healthy. But we noticed that both of us had a deviated septum repaired. for sinus problems. So that was like the only common physical thing that we found as far as a medical thing. But, that was interesting to think that perhaps might have been genetic in some way.
Well, now you have a whole new set of relatives in your life, and that must be something else, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And on my father's side, it's an even bigger group, because they say he was one of 5 brothers, and they had 3 sisters too, and so not only do I have half siblings in my life from that side of the family now, I also have a whole bunch of cousins.
How is that? Are you guys really kind of connected? You chat with each other? How do you feel about that, I guess, part of your family being in your life now?
Well, I'm certainly enjoying it.
Well, that's good.
Again, I have my adoptive family too, and as I've said before, you don't have to give up one family to accept a new one. So, I have my adoptive family and I have my biological family. So, I say that most people only have 2 branches to their family tree, and I have 4.
I know it was, and something that sometimes may be up, and you see this in movies too. It's sort of, they make it real dramatic when the sibling decides to pursue this to find out who their real parents are, and then there seems to be some friction or, something between the parents that had adopted them and the sibling themselves, and you had actually written a letter to your mother.
Yes, I had.
And tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I say my parents never talked about my adoption to me, growing up, at least not after I was old enough to understand it. So I did have that one conversation with my dad. Well, we had a couple more follow-up ones after that, but while he was in the hospital talking about my adoption, but my mother wasn't around for those conversations, and she didn't even know we'd had them. So she went on, I think, thinking that that secret was safe. Well, after I identified my birth mother and found my brother and was starting to get together with him, I thought, this could happen someday, that he could be over at the house visiting us and she could show up unannounced, as she had a habit of doing. So I better let her know that I found my brother. So I wrote her a nice letter explaining that how I had discovered years before about my adoption, and how it certainly didn't make any difference in the fact that they were always my parents, and I loved her and loved my dad, and I wasn't angry about them keeping a secret or anything. It didn't have any negative effects on me, but I wanted to tell her that I had done some searching and I had found my brother, and that I liked him, and that we would be getting together from time to time. And I asked her if she'd like to talk about this. And so after she got the letter, she called me a couple days later, and we had a conversation about it. And this was the only conversation we ever had about this, because as soon as we were done with that, she chose like it never happened and never wanted to talk about it again. So I respected her wishes, and I never brought it up.
And that's the key, too, in the whole scheme of things that I've noticed is, as you go out in pursuit of this, for instance, I did contact my oldest sister. And, here was the funny feeling I had, though, afterwards is, well, we had a nice long conversation. It was real enjoyable, but then you just don't know, what do I say after this? What do we talk about? So it became kind of a challenge for me after that.
Well, again, I see most of my new relatives kind of like I do with my old relatives, that none of them actually live, right real close to me, and I don't see them on a regular basis. I have one half-sister and one cousin from my father's side that live in Michigan, and most of the rest of them live in Texas, where the family was from originally, and many of them returned to Texas. So I do get down there about once a year. I have a DNA conference I go to in Houston every year, and when I do that, I take advantage of the opportunity of being there and and I go visit a number of my relatives. I've got a half brother in Texas and several cousins, so I try to get together with them every time I'm down there. And if my wife is coming with me some years, so we both get together with all the family down there.
Well, I can say honestly, yeah, the book is a very encouraging thing for people to read who want to go about these discoveries, much like I did. Mine seemed to be a lot swifter somehow. I think it's because I had a direct connection with who he was versus you trying to find out who these people were, and especially navigating states that like to send fake birth certificates. But I was curious, how did you use DNA in your search, and did it help, or how did you go about using that? If so.
Okay. Well, I went down many dead ends. I did a lot. For years, I did research of what I could from the records. Again, my birth mother had died a year after I was born, so I never had a chance to meet her. But I was able to find people that she had dated, men that she had dated, and ultimately I was able to find girlfriends of hers who turned out to have a lot of information. And that helped me, get started. But every man that we identified as a possibility, for one reason or another, turned out not to be my father. And it was only in many years after I started this that I heard about genetic genealogy. And back then, this was like 2006, the only tests available were a Y-DNA test that only men could take and a mitochondrial DNA test that anyone could take. And I figured since I was looking for my father, my best source might be to do a Y-DNA test, and that checks my Y chromosome and compares it with other men in the database who have also done the same test. And if we share significant amounts of that Y chromosome, it means that we have a common ancestor somewhere in our paternal lines. So if I go up my father's father's father, and my DNA match goes up his father's father's father, somewhere they intersected a common man. And, in Western society, family surnames generally pass down the paternal line. A man's son has the same last name as him, and his son generally carries on that same last name. And because of that, my idea was if I could see who I matched and what their last name was, there could be a good chance that that was the same last name as my biological father. So that's what I did, and I did have one really good match with a man in Florida. And I contacted him to see if he'd had any branches of his family in Michigan, and no, he had not. He'd always been in the Southeast, so any common ancestor, or the definite common ancestor, would have been too far back for him to trace. But I thought, well, this gives me a name, and I went back and I looked through all of my records of 25 years or so of searching, where I'd recorded the names of men my mother dated, men my mother worked with, men my mother must have known because they lived in the same small community. And I went back through all that list, and I found a man with that same last name. So he became my prime suspect. So what I did was I tried to track him down. It turns out he was deceased, but I found a niece of his. And the niece was intrigued by my story and decided she was going to help me. So basically, this man that was my prime suspect, it turns out, he had 4 brothers. There were 5 of them. And all of them lived in the same area as my birth mother, which was in the western suburbs of Detroit. So the DNA match really suggested that there was a good chance that one of them was my father, and I already knew this one man. He actually was my mother's employer at one time. And so I thought, well, they definitely knew each other. But maybe his brothers knew her too. It's possible because they all lived in the same area. So he was my suspect, but I didn't really know for sure if he was my father. I'd found the right family, I felt, but I didn't know if I'd found the right man. Well, I looked around at the time, and there were tests available called Sibling Tests. And basically what they are is a paternity test, but applied to see if you can tell if siblings match. Well, while those tests work really well in a parent-child relationship because there are certain markers that then must be passed down, it doesn't work so well in any other relationship because there's just a certain amount of randomness involved. And so all they can do is calculate the probability that two people are siblings or half-siblings. So anyway, I thought, well, hey, this may settle it. So I got the names of sons. It didn't have to be sons, but I decided to work with the sons. All 5 brothers were deceased, but all of them had living sons. So I got their names and addresses from my family contact, and I sent them all letters explaining who I was, how I decided that I was probably related to that family, why I wanted to settle this, sent along some pictures of myself to show them hopefully that there was a family resemblance, because the niece that I had contacted said there was definitely a family resemblance. So anyway, I asked them if they would participate in this DNA test, and every one of them agreed to do it. So when we got the results, the highest probability of being my sibling was the son of the man my mother had worked for. So my prime suspect looked like indeed the man. Well, so we thought we had this settled, and I went on for about 4 years, almost 5 years really, of meeting my siblings and cousins and getting integrated into the family. And then there were some new tests that had come out, these Autosomal Dna Tests, which either men or women can take, and they measure the amount of DNA you share with any match. So it could be not just your direct paternal line, for example, but they could be matching you from any of your lines of your family tree. So I thought, well, this could help me with my genealogy because I was into genealogy by then. And if you test somebody that's on, say, your father's side, it helps you sort your matches, because matches you have in common with that person would be on your father's side. Matches that you have that they don't have would probably be from your mother's side. So I thought I'll do that. So I picked a couple of my picked one that I thought was a half-sibling and one that I thought was a cousin, had them tested, and it turns out the results came out completely backwards. My half-sibling, or who I thought was a half-sibling, was really my cousin, and the cousin I tested turned out to be really a half-sibling. So this told me conclusively that the brother I had been assuming for the last 4 or 5 years was my father was not my father. It was one of his other brothers. So I finally did get the answer. And, of course, it was kind of awkward because I had to explain to everybody, well, it turns out that so-and-so is not my father. It's this other guy. So, but it was good to finally get it right.
Well, it's quite a story, no doubt about that.
Yes.
Quite an exhaustive search, but in the end, as you've been sharing with us, it's been definitely well worth it. So.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So tell us, for our listeners out there, how they can go about getting the book, because I know there's going to be a lot more. We're going to have you back on the program to talk about these other things here that I think people will find very unique. But how can they get the book so they can, take a look at this and, see what kind of things come up for them?
Well, the book is available in various bookstores. It is. I originally did a self-published version, which was only available online. And then because the sales and reviews were so good, it was picked up by a conventional publisher. So now It's available from a regular publisher, and which means that bookstores can buy it through their suppliers and so. So some bookstores will have it. Any bookstore can order it. But on the other hand, the easiest way is to just go from Amazon, Amazon.com, and order it. Amazon has basically 3 different formats. They have the print version, they have a Kindle version for ebook readers, and then they have the audio book version, which is actually produced and available through Audible.com. So you can get any of the versions there. And I have a link that I created that makes it real easy, and that is in your browser, just type in findingfamilybook.com, and that takes you right to the Amazon page.
Well, very good. Richard, thank you so much for sharing your story with our listeners today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me, too.
You bet.
Daniel, thank you very much.
You bet. We'll look forward to having you back on the program again.
Okay.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. If you're doing a little searching, you could also search for Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.